She came through the door of the roadside bar with no shoes and no sound, and for 1 full second nobody moved. You need to understand what that door usually let in. Truckers, ranch hands with dust in their teeth, the occasional lost tourist who read the neon sign wrong and expected something friendlier than what they got. It did not let in barefoot women at midnight in December, hair stuck to her face with sweat despite the cold, eyes doing the thing eyes do when a person has stopped deciding what to feel and started only deciding where to run. 29 men sat in that bar. You will meet some of them properly. You will meet the one who stood up first, slow, like his knees hurt, because they did. You will meet the one who did not stand at all, who simply reached under the bar without looking, because some habits outlive the reasons for them. Stay until the end, because 11 years from that midnight, she rides back through that same door, and what she brings with her, and what one of those men finally says to her, is the reason this story exists at all. Subscribe if stories like this matter to you. Tell me what town you're watching from tonight. That was later. That was the debt paid. First came the night the debt was opened, and the road that led her to it. The bar sat on a stretch of 2-lane highway outside a town small enough that the gas station and the church shared a parking lot. The sign out front had said Black Ridge Tavern for 18 years, though only half its letters still lit. The D had gone dark sometime around a divorce nobody there liked to discuss, and no one had gotten around to fixing it, because fixing things you've stopped hoping for takes a kind of energy grief doesn't leave you. Inside, it smelled like fry oil and gun oil and the particular staleness of a room where men come to not be asked questions. Patches on leather, gray in beards that had once been brown, a jukebox that skipped on the second verse of the same 3 songs it had skipped on for a decade. It was the kind of place where a stranger walking in got measured before he got greeted. Boots first, hands second, eyes last. She did not walk in like a stranger measuring anything. She walked in like the floor was the only solid thing left in the world, and she was barely trusting that. Behind her, the parking lot held nothing but wind and gravel dust, and the highway beyond it ran flat and black toward a horizon with no other lights on it for 11 miles. The door did not close gently behind her. It banged, once, hard, like something trying to get back out. And that was when the man near the window, the one with a faded eagle on his forearm and a coffee gone cold in front of him, the one who had buried more people than he liked to count and had learned, in the burying, exactly what fear looked like on a person's face before they said a single word, set his cup down without a sound. His name for himself, in that moment, was nothing. He was only attention, the old training rising up through the coffee and the cigarette smoke and the 14 years since he'd last worn a uniform that meant anything. He had learned in a country whose name he did not say out loud anymore that the body announces what the mouth will not. Her shoulders were up near her ears. Her arms were wrapped across her stomach, not for warmth, but the way a person holds themselves together when there is a real fear that something inside might come apart. Her feet were bare on a floor that had not been cleaned since the Reagan administration, and there was a thin line of blood, not fresh, drying dark along the arch of her left foot, and she had not looked down at it once, which told him more than the blood did. The room did what rooms like that do. It went quiet in pieces, not all at once. First, the 2 men playing pool near the back, cues lifted mid-shot, then the bartender, a heavy-set woman with a faded rose on her collarbone who had cut off exactly 1 man too many not to notice trouble walking in on 2 legs. The jukebox kept going, skipped on the second verse. Nobody moved to fix it. She stood just inside the doorway, chest rising fast and shallow, eyes doing the same math his had just finished, counting exits, counting men, counting distance. And something in her face when she finished the count was not quite relief. It was closer to the exhaustion of someone who has run out of places left to be afraid in. Outside, headlights swept the gravel lot once, slow, and kept moving, not stopping, not yet. He did not stand up. Standing up too fast was its own kind of threat, and he had learned that too, somewhere, from someone, a long time before this bar and this town had become the whole of his life. He kept his hands visible on the table, the way you'd keep them visible for a spooked animal or a man with a rifle, and he said, in a voice pitched low enough that it would not carry past the first 3 feet of air between them, "You can sit down, Nobody here's gonna touch you. She did not sit down. She turned instead, just her head, just enough to look back at the door she had come through, at the black rectangle of night still holding its shape in the frame, and whatever she saw there, or expected to see there, any second now, made her flinch first and speak second. "He's coming," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "He's right behind me." The room did not go quiet. It went still, which was a different thing entirely, a thing he had felt before, in places where quiet would have gotten a man killed. Chairs did not scrape. Nobody reached for anything under a jacket, because nobody needed to yet, but every head in the bar had turned by degrees toward the door, slow, the way men turn who have trained themselves not to look surprised even when they are. He kept his eyes on her face and not on the door, because someone needed to, because if he looked away now, she would have no anchor left in the room at all. "How far behind?" he said. "I don't know. I don't know. I ran the whole—" She stopped herself, swallowed whatever the rest of that sentence was going to cost her. Her bare feet had left faint damp prints on the boards, already fading in the heat of the room, and he found himself doing the arithmetic without meaning to. How far the nearest paved road was, how long a person could run on gravel and blacktop before the soles gave out, how she had made it this far and still had feet at all. Behind him, near the pool table, a big man with a gray beard down to the second button of his shirt set his cue against the wall without a sound. That was the loudest thing that happened in the next 10 seconds, the felt soft click of wood against wood, and it told him everything about how the night was going to go from here. "Sit," he said again, and this time it was not a suggestion, and this time she heard the difference, and folded down into the chair across from him like something had finally let her. Outside, an engine slowed on the highway, not turned in, not yet, just slowed, the sound of a vehicle deciding. "What's he driving?" he asked her. "Truck. Gray. There's a—" Her hand moved toward her own collarbone and stopped, hovering, as if she'd meant to point to a decal or a dent, and thought better of naming it out loud, as if naming it would summon it faster than the engine could. "Okay," he said. "That's enough." He had asked exactly enough to be useful, and not one question more, because more questions were for later, if there was a later, and pushing too hard now would only prove to her that this room was one more place a man decided how much of her story he was owed. He had learned that the hard way too, from the other side of a table like this one, years ago, in a room that had not been kind about it. The gray-bearded man drifted toward the front window without seeming to drift anywhere at all, and looked out through the neon at the dark beyond the lot, at the half-lit sign buzzing red against the glass, and said nothing, which from him was its own kind of report. The engine outside did not fade, it idled. The idling engine did something to the room that words had not managed. Chairs stopped scraping. A man near the pool table set his cue down against the felt without the click it should have made, as if he had lowered it in stages. Someone's boot heel, tapping some private rhythm against a bar stool leg, went still. She had gone quiet too, but it was a different quiet than the fear quiet from 10 minutes before. This was listening. Her whole body had turned into an instrument for the sound outside, the way animals turn toward weather before people feel the first drop of rain. The gray-bearded man did not move from the window. He watched the truck's headlights cut sideways along the county road, watched them slow at the mouth of the gravel lot, and then, after a long 3 seconds that felt longer, continue past, not stopping. Not yet. A man deciding whether tonight was the night to be certain, or the night to circle back later, with more certainty than a dark parking lot could offer him alone. "He's scouting," the man at the table said, low, not to her, not coming in blind. He had seen that pattern before, in another life, wearing a different kind of boots, in a country where scouting a position before committing to it was how men who wanted to live long enough got old. It was not a comforting kind of knowledge to have. It was only useful. She flinched at the word scouting, like it had touched something. "He does that," she said. 4 words. The first sentence she had offered without being asked for it, and it came out flat, informational, the tone of someone reciting a weather pattern she had learned to read because her life depended on the forecast. "He'll go around the block, twice, maybe 3 times. Then he comes back." "How do you know that?" Because I used to be the one driving. She said it, and then looked immediately like she wished the words had stayed inside her mouth, like she had handed over a piece of herself, heavier than she meant to carry, across a room full of strangers. Nobody asked her to explain that. The rule held, even now, even with an engine somewhere out in the dark making its slow, deliberate loop through a town with one stoplight and no cameras. The gray-bearded man finally turned from the window. He looked at her feet again, bare, dust-gray, one heel cracked in a way that spoke of miles walked without shoes long before tonight, and then at the door, and then at the row of men who had gone still and attentive in a way that had nothing performative in it, no posturing, just weight settling into place, the way weight settles before a building decides whether it will hold. "Somebody get her something for those feet," he said. It was not the sentence anyone expected. It was, of the whole night, the one that would matter most. A young one, younger than most of them, with a jaw that hadn't decided yet whether it belonged to a boy or a man, disappeared into the back and came out with a shoebox of tube socks still folded in plastic, the kind sold 3 for $1 at the truck stop off the interstate. He didn't hand them to her directly. He set the box on the bar top and stepped back, the way a man might approach something wild he didn't want to spook, and that small courtesy did more to loosen something behind her ribs than any word had managed all night. She didn't cry. She would tell people later, when there was a later to tell it in, that she had trained herself out of crying the way other people train themselves out of biting their nails, that tears in that house had only ever been used against her, catalogued and thrown back during the next argument as proof of weakness. So she sat on the bar stool with her cracked heel resting against the rail and pulled a sock over feet that hadn't known warmth in longer than she could measure, and the room let her do it without watching too closely, which was its own kind of gift. 11 years forward, in a room with better lighting and a coffee maker that actually worked, a woman with the same jaw, steadier now, unhurried, sat across a folding table from a girl of 19 who wouldn't take off her jacket even though the shelter kept the thermostat high on purpose. The girl's knees bounced. Her hands stayed inside her sleeves. "You don't have to tell me anything tonight," the woman said. "Everybody says that." "I mean it." The girl looked at her, the way people look at weather they don't trust, waiting for the turn. "How long you been doing this?" "Long enough to know the question you're not asking." The girl's mouth tightened, a small defensive movement, and for a moment, the fluorescent light caught something old in her face, some inherited exhaustion that didn't belong to 19 years lived. "He says he'll change." "They do that math for you every time. 3 strikes, then he's better." The woman said it without judgment, the way a person recites a fact they've buried and exhumed too many times to feel it anymore. "I used to keep score too." Back in the bar, decades collapsing into a single suspended night, the gray-bearded man had gone to the window again, watching for the truck that might circle a 4th time. Behind him the girl, barefoot no longer, sock-warmed, still trembling in ways nobody named out loud, asked the question that would outlast the smoke and the neon and every mile any of them would ever ride afterward. "Why are you doing this for someone you don't know?" He didn't answer right away. Outside, an engine idled somewhere past the second streetlight, deciding something. He let the question sit the way he let most things sit, turning it over the way a man turns over a stone to see what's living underneath before he decides whether to pick it up. "Because 31 years ago, nobody did it for someone I knew," he said, "and I've had 31 years to figure out what that costs." The girl didn't ask what he meant. She had the particular stillness of someone who has learned that questions sometimes cost more than they're worth, and she let the sentence stand where he'd left it, unfinished, the way you leave a door open a few inches without stepping through. The engine outside idled another 10 seconds, then pulled away, gravel hissing under tires that had made their decision without consulting anyone inside the bar. He watched the taillights shrink to nothing past the second streetlight and felt his shoulders drop half an inch, a small mechanical surrender he wouldn't have admitted to if she'd asked. 11 years forward, in a room with better light and worse coffee, the woman across the table folded her hands and asked something that rhymed with the same silence. "Did you know that night, what it would turn into?" The younger woman, no longer 19, no longer barefoot in any sense that mattered, shook her head slowly, watching the fluorescent tube overhead flicker once and steady. I didn't know anything, she said. I didn't even know if I'd be alive by morning. You don't plan gratitude when you're just trying to get through a door. But you remember the door. I remember the door. She said it like a fact, recovered from evidence. Precise, dated, load-bearing. Bar door, cold brass handle. A man standing behind it who didn't ask my name before he asked if I was hurt. Back in the collapsed night that never fully released its grip on either timeline, the gray-bearded man turned from the window at last, and something in his face had rearranged itself into a decision. "You're not going back to that trailer," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't quite an order either. It was closer to a fact being laid on the table, the way you'd lay down a hand of cards you weren't proud of, but weren't ashamed of either. Not tonight. Maybe not ever, if you don't want to. The girl's eyes went to the door, then to the men scattered through the bar who had stopped pretending not to listen, then back to him. Where would I go? He didn't answer that either, not because he had nothing to say, but because the answer wasn't his to give alone. It belonged to 28 other men who hadn't spoken yet, who were watching him the way men watch a leader, deciding whether a thing is worth the weight it will put on all their backs together. And somewhere behind the bar, a phone had already been lifted off its cradle. The phone call lasted 40 seconds. He gave an address, said the word "tonight" twice, and hung up without saying goodbye, the way men do when goodbye is understood between them already. Then he set the receiver down and looked at her like he was recalculating something, some old equation he'd stopped trusting the answer to years ago. 11 years later, in a room with soft lighting and a box of tissues nobody had touched yet, she would tell a room of new advocates that the moment she knew she was safe wasn't the moment the men stood up, or the moment someone locked the door behind her. It was the sound of that phone being replaced in its cradle, gently, like something that mattered. In the present, she sat across from a woman half her age, who wouldn't meet her eyes, whose knuckles were wrapped around a paper cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. Outside the window that used to be a bar window, the parking lot held 4 motorcycles that hadn't moved in 2 days, because the men who rode them had a rule now, unspoken but absolute. Nobody sits with a scared woman alone for the first 48 hours if she doesn't want them to, but nobody leaves the property either. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said to the young woman now, in a voice she'd built over a decade of practice, a voice that had once belonged to someone else and now belonged only to her. "You just have to stay." Back in the collapsed night, the bar had gone quiet in a way that wasn't tense so much as attentive, the particular quiet of men deciding something without needing to vote on it. One of them, thick through the shoulders, with a jaw like a doorframe, finally spoke without turning from his beer. "She stays at the clubhouse, Sarah's room." Nobody asked who Sarah was. Nobody would, for years, until she finally learned that Sarah had been someone's daughter, once, and the room had been kept ready for a version of a daughter who never came home. The barefoot girl looked down at her feet, filthy from the gravel and the 2 miles of dark highway shoulder she'd run, and for the first time since she'd burst through that door with her breath tearing out of her in ragged pieces, something in her shoulders came down an inch. Not trust yet. Just the absence of bracing. "He'll come looking," she said quietly. "Let him," the gray-bearded man answered, and there was nothing performed in it, no movie-line swagger, just the flat certainty of a man stating the weather. He won't find what he's looking for. In the present, the young woman across the table finally lifted her eyes, and what was in them wasn't hope exactly. Not yet, but the first thin crack where hope might eventually get in. "How do you know it gets better?" she asked. The advocate didn't answer right away. She was looking past her, out the window, at 4 motorcycles gleaming faintly under a neon sign that still, after everything, only half worked. She let the silence hold for a moment longer, because some answers needed weight underneath them before they'd bear the asking. "Because I was you," she finally said. 11 years ago, same table, near enough, different chair, but the same wanting to believe someone when every part of your body has been trained not to. The young woman's hands were wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and she hadn't noticed, and the advocate hadn't mentioned it, because noticing things out loud too early was its own kind of pressure, and she'd learned that from men who'd never once made her feel small for shaking. In the past, the barefoot girl sat with her knees drawn up on a bar stool that had been swept of glass and wiped down twice, though no one told her that, and a woman named Sarah's brother, nobody had said the word brother, not yet, that would come later, in pieces, the way all of it came, set a plate of eggs in front of her that she hadn't asked for and didn't touch. Eat if you want, he said. Don't if you don't. Nobody's counting. It was such a small permission. She would remember it for 11 years, the way she'd remember almost nothing else from that night with any clarity, not the make of his motorcycle, not even his face in full, just the plate, and the words, and the fact that no one was counting. Outside, headlights swept the gravel lot and died. A door somewhere hinged open and shut. The men at the bar didn't turn as one, didn't posture, didn't reach for anything. They simply became, without seeming to move at all, a wall between the door and the girl on the stool, 4 of them, then 6, positioned with the unhurried economy of men who had done this kind of arranging before, in places that weren't bars, for reasons that weren't kindness so much as instinct that had once been trained into them and never fully trained back out. In the present, the young woman finally asked the question underneath the question. Did he come? That night, the one you ran from. The advocate nodded once. He came. What happened? Nothing, she said, and there was something almost like a smile at the edge of it, though it didn't reach all the way up. That was the whole point. Nothing happened to me ever again in that room. That's not a small thing when you've never had it. Through the window, one of the 4 motorcycles caught a fuller wash of the neon, the working half of the sign throwing red across the chrome, and for a moment, the young woman's eyes stayed there instead of on her, tracking the light like it was the first steady thing she'd looked at in longer than she could say. Tell me what happened at the door, she said. That night. All of it. I want the whole thing. The advocate turned her cup a quarter turn on the table, the way she did when she was deciding where to start, and then she went back 11 years, the way you step into cold water, 1 degree at a time. Midnight had not looked like midnight in that town. The gas station sign 2 lots down had died the previous winter and never been fixed, so the only light on that stretch of road belonged to the bar, half its neon dead, the other half bleeding red across the gravel lot like something injured. She had come down the shoulder of the highway barefoot because her shoes had come off somewhere in the running, and there had been no time to go back for them. The asphalt had still held the day's heat even at that hour, August heat, the kind that doesn't leave when the sun does, and she remembered that detail specifically, the way the ground burned the soles of her feet while everything else in her body had gone cold. She hadn't chosen the bar, she had chosen the light. Inside, 29 men had been in various stages of a Tuesday night that meant nothing to any of them, and every one of them would later tell some version of the same moment, the door banging open too hard for wind. No wind that night anyway, and a girl standing in the frame with her chest going like a rabbit's and her eyes doing the thing that trained men recognize before the mind catches up, the scanning, the counting of exits that a body does when it has learned the hard way that rooms are not safe by default. Nobody moved for a second, the advocate said. That's the part people don't expect. They didn't rush me. They didn't ask questions. It was like watching men reset a machine, like they'd been built for exactly this and never told. One man near the pool table had set his cue down without a sound. Another had angled his stool half a foot, closing a sightline to the door without seeming to close anything at all. The bartender, she remembered, had simply reached under the bar and left his hand there, not drawing anything, just resting, the way a man rests a hand on a dog he trusts to be calm, unless calm stops being the right thing. And then a truck pulled into the lot, she said, headlights coming up slow over the gravel, and every single one of them turned toward that door like it was one animal instead of 29 men. The young woman had gone still, the way she got when the story stopped being a story and became something closer to a room she was standing in. What did they do, she said, before he even got inside? The advocate looked at her for a long moment, and outside, the neon buzzed once, faithfully, on its half-lit circuit. She didn't answer right away. In the present, the young woman's tea had gone cold in her hands, and she hadn't noticed. Outside, a car passed on the highway and its headlights swept the shelter's front window the way headlights had swept that gravel lot 11 years ago, and the advocate watched the young woman's eyes track the light the same way, some old animal part of her checking the door before her mind caught up. They didn't do anything, the advocate said finally. That's the part nobody believes. They didn't grab bats. Nobody stood up fast. The man closest to the pool table just tucked his hands into his jacket pockets, easy, like he was cold. But I found out later there was a folding knife in that pocket he'd carried since Da Nang, and he'd had his thumb on the clip the whole time. She had learned that detail years afterward from the man himself on a porch in October when he was drunk enough on grief to tell her things he wouldn't tell sober. He'd said it like an apology. She hadn't understood then why a man would apologize for restraint. In the past, the truck's engine had cut in the lot, and for 4 full seconds nobody in that bar moved or spoke, and the girl, Barefoot, 17, the rain drying stiff in her hair, had watched 29 strangers arrange themselves around her like furniture nailed to a floor, permanent, immovable, offering no reason for a man to think anything unusual was happening inside except that the room had gotten very quiet. The door had opened. Cold air first, then him. He was not large. That had surprised her then, and it surprised her still, telling it. He was an ordinary man in a canvas coat, thinning at the crown, the kind of man who might sell you insurance or coach a boys' baseball team, and his eyes had gone around that bar once, cataloging, the way men like that always did, counting exits, counting witnesses, deciding what a room would let him get away with. The president had not moved from his stool. He had simply turned his head, slow, and said one thing, quiet enough that only the front tables heard it clearly. She's not out here. That was all. No name, no question asked or answered. A closed door dressed up as a sentence. The man in the canvas coat had stood in that threshold a moment longer than made sense, weighing 29 backs and shoulders and the particular stillness of men who were not afraid of him, and something in his face had recalculated. In the shelter's kitchen now, the young woman set her cup down without drinking from it. He just left, she said, not a question exactly. He just left, the advocate agreed, that night. She let the sentence sit there, because the young woman needed to hear the shape of what came after it before she could be trusted with the shape of what came before. He left because leaving cost him nothing, and staying cost him a fight he couldn't win in front of witnesses, and men like that always did the math before they did anything else. That was 11 years gone now, and the kitchen smelled like burnt coffee, and the particular sourness of a dish towel left too long on the counter, and the young woman across the table, 22 now, not the barefoot girl who had come through that door with her feet cut open on gravel, was turning her cup in a slow circle without lifting it. Did he come back? She asked, after. Once. The advocate kept her voice level, the way she'd trained herself to keep it for exactly this kind of question, the kind that arrived sideways, dressed as curiosity, when it was really something closer to fear. 3 weeks later, middle of the afternoon that time, not midnight. Wanted to talk to the president about a bar tab he said he was owed. Was he? No. The rain had started somewhere outside the shelter's kitchen window, the first real rain in 11 days, and it came down against the glass in a way that made the light in the room seem dimmer than it was, though nothing had changed about the bulb overhead. The young woman looked at her own hands. There was a small white scar across the base of her thumb, old, the kind a person stopped noticing on themselves but that other people's eyes still caught. What happened? When he came back? The advocate thought about how to say it. There was a version of the story that was clean and a version that was true, and they were not always the same version, though in this case they were close enough. The president told him there was no tab, told him the club didn't do business with men who hunted women down. Then he asked him to leave, and when the man didn't move fast enough, 6 of them stood up at once, not fast, not loud, just stood. And he left. He left. And he never came back. Not once. Not in 11 years. Not that anyone's tracked. She said it plainly because plain was what the young woman needed, not comfort dressed as certainty but the flat, verifiable shape of a fact. That's not luck. That's 29 men who decided a thing and then kept deciding it every day after, whether anyone was watching or not. The young woman was quiet for a while. Outside, the rain thickened, drumming harder against the tin awning that covered the shelter's side entrance, the same entrance that had once been a delivery door for kegs and now had a wheelchair ramp and a keypad lock. "I keep thinking I should be over it by now," the young woman said finally. 11 years. People say that. Get over it." "You don't get over it," the advocate said. "You get around. You build a life big enough that it doesn't sit in the middle of the room anymore." She reached for the coffee pot, more out of habit than thirst. "I know a girl who did exactly that. Took her 11 years and a lot of help she didn't ask for." The young woman looked up then, something shifting behind her eyes, the particular alertness of a person who has just heard herself described from a distance. "You," she said. "That's you." The advocate didn't answer right away. She poured coffee she didn't want into a mug she'd washed 100 times. The porcelain chipped at the handle in the shape of a crescent moon, and she set it down without drinking from it. 11 years earlier, this exact stretch of floor had been sawdust and cigarette ash. Now it was laminate the color of wet sand, easy to mop, easy to disinfect, chosen for exactly that reason by a committee that had included, among its 7 voting members, 4 men who still called each other by road names instead of the names on their licenses. "It doesn't matter who," the advocate said. "It matters that it's possible." But the rain kept falling, and the young woman kept watching her, and the silence between them stretched the way silence does when a smaller truth is circling a bigger one, unwilling to land. Across town, in a garage that smelled of two-stroke oil and cold concrete, an older man sat on an overturned crate with a torque wrench in his hand and did nothing with it. He'd meant to tighten the bolt on a fender he'd already tightened twice. His hands had started doing that lately, repeating motions, finishing tasks that were already finished, as if his body needed the illusion of usefulness more than his mind needed the result. His knees didn't fold the way they used to when he swung a leg over a seat. There was a new stiffness low in his back that no amount of stretching untangled, and some mornings he woke and lay still for a full minute, cataloging which parts of him still answered when called. He'd gotten a text an hour ago, 4 words, no punctuation. "She's here again tonight." He hadn't answered it yet. He wasn't avoiding it, exactly. He told himself that, turning the wrench over once in his palm. He was only deciding how a man his age walks into a room holding 11 years without dropping any of it on the floor. Outside, the storm that was drowning the shelter's tin awning 3 miles east hadn't reached him yet. The sky over the garage was still dry, still holding its breath, the kind of pressure in the air that old injuries answered before instruments did. His shoulder, the one he'd broken twice, once falling off a roof at 19, and once falling off nothing at all, just the weight of a year he didn't talk about, had been aching since noon. He stood, finally, joints announcing themselves one by one, and reached for a jacket that had a patch on the back nobody had touched or altered in over a decade, because that patch belonged to a man who wasn't there to object, and also because some things a club simply doesn't retire. He had a drive to make. Rain or no rain. The garage door groaned upward on its track, and the smell that came in with the dry evening air was diesel and cut grass, and something underneath both of those. Something that had been there 11 years ago, too. Old rubber, old rope, the smell of a place that had outlived 3 owners and 1 fire. He didn't look back at the bike before he swung the jacket over his shoulders. He'd learned, a long time ago, that looking back at things you loved before you needed them was a way of asking permission, and he'd stopped asking permission from machines the year his knees started answering weather reports before the radio did. 11 years is not a long time to a mountain. It is a very long time to a woman standing barefoot in a doorway with blood on her collarbone that wasn't hers, and eyes that had already decided she would rather die running than live caught. He remembered the eyes more than the blood. He always had. The phone buzzed again on the workbench, face down, and he let it buzz, because the message underneath the first one didn't need reading to be understood. He knew the second sender. He knew the shorthand of men who had ridden together long enough to stop needing full sentences. "She's here again tonight," meant something had shifted in the girl. No, not a girl anymore. hadn't been a girl in a decade, meant something had shifted in the girl, woman. And shifts like that in a place built out of other people's worst nights were never small. He swung a leg over the bike before the jacket was even zipped, the old leather stiff at the shoulders the way it always was in spring, softening only after the first hour of riding, like it needed convincing too. The engine caught on the second try, which for a machine that old was a mercy he didn't take for granted. 3 miles east, rain was already falling on a tin awning that had been patched twice and replaced once, over a door with a sign fully lit now, every letter working, red and blue humming steady into a wet dark that used to be nothing but static and silence, and one flickering vowel nobody had ever bothered fixing until they had a reason to. He rode toward it anyway, dry sky above him, wet road waiting ahead, carrying 11 years the way a man carries a thing he built with his own hands, carefully, and without needing anyone to tell him it mattered. Behind him, the garage light stayed on, forgotten, throwing a long yellow rectangle across the gravel, empty now, waiting for no one in particular, the way places do when the people who matter to them are already somewhere else, moving toward each other in the dark. 11 years before, the same 3 miles had taken him 20 minutes on a bike that ran clean, because the road had been dry and his hands had not yet learned to shake in cold weather. Now it took longer. He told himself it was the rain. He knew it was his knees. The girl. She had not been a girl then either. Not really. 17 going on 40. But the word had stuck the way words do when you meet someone at their worst hour. Had come through that door with nothing on her feet, and blood already drying above her eyebrow, and the jukebox had been playing something nobody remembered afterward, because nobody had been listening to music once she said the word. Please. He remembered the silence more than the sound. 29 men going quiet at once was not something you forgot. The rain found him half a mile out, fine and cold, needling through the gap at his collar he never zipped all the way, out of habit, out of some old refusal to be fully sealed against weather he'd survived worse of. He didn't slow down. The tires held the wet asphalt the way they always had, and he let the bike do the thinking his knees no longer wanted to. Behind the counter that night, someone had put a blanket around her shoulders before anyone asked whose blanket it was. That detail had never made it into any telling of the story, not because it was small, but because the men who'd been there didn't talk about the parts that made them tender. They talked about the door, the noise, the moment they stood up, not the blanket, not the way one of them, dead 9 years now, buried under a stone nobody visited enough, had knelt to check her feet for glass before anyone thought to check anything else. He thought about that man now, the way he always did riding this stretch, the fence posts ticking by like a slow metronome counting something down. The sign came into view before the building did, red and blue steady in the wet dark, no flicker left in it anywhere. He remembered it flickering for 6 years after they fixed the roof, after they fixed the register, after they fixed nearly everything else and let that one letter go dark, because nobody had the money left, and nobody had thought it mattered enough to matter. It had mattered. He understood that now, watching it burn clean through the rain. He downshifted at the gravel lot, boots finding the ground the way they always had, the ritual of it unchanged even as everything around it had. 2 other bikes were already there, dripping under the tin awning, and past the glass, warm light spilled out onto wet pavement, and in it, for just a moment, he thought he saw a small shape move past the window, quick, curious, followed by a taller one, reaching to pull her back from the glass. He cut the engine and sat there a moment longer than he needed to. The rain kept falling in that steady, unhurried way rain falls when it has all night to finish its business, and he let it fall on him a while longer before he swung his leg over and stood. His knees told him about the years now in a language they hadn't used before, a low ache that started somewhere behind the joint and traveled up into the hip, and he stood in the gravel and let that ache have its say before he walked toward the door. 11 years. He turned the number over the way he'd turned over the odometer numbers on 3 different bikes since then. Numbers that meant something once and now just meant time, had kept doing what time does. Inside, the smell was different than it used to be. Less cigarette, more coffee, a clean disinfectant smell underneath it, that he associated now with the counseling rooms in the back, the ones that used to be storage. But under that, if he stood still enough, he could still find the old smell. Fry grease and beer, and 40 years of boots on the same floorboards, patient as a fingerprint that refuses to wash out. He saw the girl first, the small shape, gone quiet now, standing half behind a woman's leg, with one hand fisted in her jacket. 11 years old, he knew that the way he knew the mile markers on the highway outside, a fact worn smooth from handling. She was looking at him with an expression he recognized before he could name why. A measuring look, careful, older than her face. The look of someone who had learned early that rooms could turn on you, and it paid to watch the door. He'd seen that look on her mother once. Barefoot, midnight, rain, coming sideways through a door that didn't lock right. "You made it," the woman said, and her voice had changed too, steadier now, a voice that had learned to speak calm into other people's panic for a living. She didn't move toward him. She let him come the rest of the way himself, the way she always had, the way that had told him something back then, and told him something different now. "Wouldn't miss it," he said, which was true, and also not the whole of it. The girl didn't step out from behind her mother's leg. She studied him, the beard grayer, the leather softer at the seams, the patches faded to something like old photographs, and something in her face shifted, not fear exactly, more like recalculation. "Are you one of them?" she asked. "The ones from before?" He looked at her mother first, some old instinct asking permission he didn't need to ask anymore. "I'm one of them," he said. "There's more coming. 20-some, last I heard." The girl's eyes went wide, just slightly, and she leaned a fraction further out from behind the leg that had been her only shield a moment before. Outside, another engine cut through the rain, and another set of headlights swung into the lot. Rain kept coming down in that steady, businesslike way it had all afternoon, not dramatic, just relentless, the kind of rain that had nowhere else to be. He watched the headlights multiply across the wet gravel, one after another, engines idling low like something breathing. 11 years ago it had been the opposite direction. Men riding out into a night like this one, chasing a tail light that belonged to a man none of them would ever have to think about again. Tonight they were riding in, toward a doorway instead of away from one. He noticed the difference, the way he noticed most things now, quietly, and let it sit in him without comment. The girl had come out from behind her mother's leg almost entirely now, one bare sock foot forward on the mat, and something about that struck him harder than he expected. Not the bare feet themselves, just the echo of them, a small woman standing on a floor that had once held another shivering shape in the same posture. He didn't say that out loud. Some things you carried without handing them to a child. 20-some, the girl repeated, testing the number in her mouth. That's a lot of grandpas. Her mother made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like something breaking loose and being caught before it fell. "They're not all your grandpas, baby." "He said he was one of them," the girl said, pointing without accusation, the way children point at facts. "So he's a grandpa." He didn't correct her. He found, standing there dripping onto the same floorboards that had been swept and mopped and remodeled and swept again over a decade of Augusts, that he didn't want to correct her. The word landed somewhere in his chest and stayed there, warm in a place that had been cold so long he'd stopped noticing the cold as a temperature and started experiencing it as simply the way things were. Outside, doors slammed one after another, boots on gravel, low voices calling names across the rain, the particular unhurried noise of men who had nowhere urgent to be except exactly here. The bar's front door, the one that had been kicked open 11 years back by a barefoot girl running from a man who thought he owned her, opened again now, slower, deliberate, held by someone letting the weather in behind him, because he wanted the room to see who was arriving. The girl's mother turned at the sound, and something crossed her face that he recognized because he'd worn it himself once, a long time ago, in this same room, in this same rain. The specific look of someone realizing they were about to be surrounded by people who had already decided, long before tonight, that they would come. The man who came through the door first had a beard gone fully white now, cropped close, and a vest with patches so old the thread had faded from black to a soft charcoal gray. He did not look at her the way strangers looked at her, the quick assessment, the categorizing glance. He looked at her the way a man looks at a door he has walked through 10,000 times, checking that it is still the same door. Behind him came others, shaking rain from their shoulders, unzipping jackets slow, and the room that had been quiet with just her and him, and the coffee machine ticking as it cooled, filled itself gradually with the particular gravity of men who moved like their knees hurt, but had decided the knees could wait. 11 years ago, the same door had opened fast, kicked by a bare foot, and the room had gone still with a different kind of attention. Alarm, then recognition, then the slow mechanical turning of men deciding, one by one, silently, without a vote, that this was now theirs to handle. Tonight the door opened slow, and the stillness that followed it was not alarm. It was arrival. It was 29 men, or what remained of them, or what had grown from them, sons who'd taken their father's patches, a woman who'd earned hers on a run to Amarillo nobody talked about anymore, filling a room they had rebuilt with their own hands so many Augusts ago that the paint had needed touching up twice. Her mother stood very still near the counter, one hand resting flat against it, as if the counter itself might explain what she was watching. She did not ask who these men were. She had already read it in the way her daughter's shoulders had dropped an inch, the moment the first boot hit the gravel outside, the tension going out of her like a held breath finally released. He watched the girl's mother's face and thought of another face, 11 years gone, standing exactly where she now stood, water pooling around bare feet, waiting to learn whether the room would ask her to leave or ask her to stay. The room had asked her to stay. It had never once, in 11 years, asked her to leave. Outside, the rain kept falling steady against the tin roof, the sound of it almost gentle now, worn down from the earlier violence of the storm into something closer to a held note. Someone set a chair down near the counter, without being asked, angled it toward the girl's mother, an invitation disguised as furniture. Another man went to the coffee machine without a word and started it again, though it had barely finished cooling, because a working coffee machine was, in this room, a kind of language. It meant, "You are not going anywhere yet, and neither are we." He looked toward the back hallway where the girl had gone quiet after telling him her mother's name, and understood, watching the men fill the room like water finding its level, that the hardest part of tonight had not yet arrived. The girl's mother sat down in the chair that had been angled for her, and for a long moment she did not speak, only looked at her hands, which were shaking in the particular way hands shake when the body has been running on fear instead of food. He recognized the shake. He had seen it on a woman 11 years ago, though back then it had been rain making her shiver, not the aftermath of a decision that could not be undone. 11 years ago, she had stood in that same doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, and the first thing anyone offered her was not a question but a towel, because a question would have asked her to explain herself before she had decided whether she was safe enough to speak at all. Tonight, someone offered the girl's mother a towel too. It was an old habit in this room, older than the shelter's paperwork, older than its license. Dry her first, ask her second. "He doesn't know she's here," the mother said finally, and her voice came out flat, rehearsed, the voice of someone who had practiced saying it calmly so many times in her head that saying it out loud felt like reading a line from someone else's script. "He thinks we're at my sister's. Does your sister know that?" No. Nobody reacted to this the way it deserved, which was with alarm, because alarm was a currency they had learned to spend carefully. Instead, the room simply absorbed the information the way it absorbed weather, noted, filed, prepared for. He thought of the ledger of names in the back office, 31 now, the newest ones written in a hand steadier than the ones 11 years old. He thought of the woman standing in his memory in the doorway, water pooling at her feet, and how nobody had asked her what came next either. Not that first night. That question had waited, patient, for the morning, and the morning after that, and eventually for 11 years' worth of mornings, until she had become someone who answered it herself, out loud, to other women in chairs just like this one. The coffee machine finished its second brew with a small mechanical sigh. Someone poured a cup and set it in front of the mother without asking if she wanted it, because offering was different from asking, and asking, right now, cost her something she didn't have. She wrapped both hands around the cup instead of drinking it. That was fine. The cup wasn't for drinking yet. It was for holding. the way the room itself was for holding, before it became anything else. Outside, headlights swept once across the wet gravel lot and kept moving, taillights receding into the dark toward the highway. Nobody in the room watched them go, but everybody, without seeming to, had counted the seconds it took the car to pass. The president watched the mother's shoulders find, slowly, a shape that wasn't bracing. It happened the way frost leaves a window, not in a moment anyone could point to, but undeniable in the after. He had seen it before. He had seen it in a doorway, 11 years and change ago, water pooling at bare feet, and he had learned since then not to name it out loud, because naming it too soon scared it back into hiding. Behind him, the daughter's laughter carried in from the hallway again, and this time the mother turned her head toward the sound, the way a compass needle turns, not decided, just pulled. "She's good with kids," the mother said, of the woman kneeling on the floor with the puzzle, though she didn't say the woman's name, because she didn't have it yet. "She's had practice," the president said. He didn't explain what kind. That story belonged to the woman herself, to be given away in her own time, in her own words, the way it had been given to him once, in pieces, over years, never all at once. Some truths lost their weight only when the person carrying them chose the moment to set them down. Outside, the rain had thinned to something almost gentle, ticking against the tin awning over the side door in a rhythm that made the room feel smaller, more contained, safer for being enclosed. A patch member, younger, quieter, the kind who still flinched at raised voices, refilled the coffee pot without being asked, and the small domestic sound of water running, then the machine clicking on, did more to steady the room than any words could have. The mother's eyes moved along the wall behind the intake desk, to the row of photographs there, riders on a stretch of two-lane road under a sky the color of a bruise healing, a woman in a leather vest cutting a ribbon in front of a building, with a sign that read half-lit even in the picture, a girl of maybe 6 holding a wrench nearly as long as her arm, grinning like she'd already decided the world owed her nothing, and she'd take what she wanted from it anyway. "Who's that?" the mother asked, nodding at the girl. "Somebody's daughter," the president said, which was true in every direction that mattered. He didn't say more. He let the mother look at the photograph as long as she wanted, let her find in it whatever she needed to find. Proof, maybe, that a child could survive a night like the one she'd just lived through and grow up laughing anyway, wrench in hand, unafraid of the size of things. The coffee finished. Nobody touched it yet. 11 years earlier, the coffee had gone cold in a different pot, on a different counter, and nobody had touched that one either. She remembered it now the way she remembered most of that night, in fragments lit too bright, the rest dark around the edges. The president had made coffee at 1 in the morning, for no reason anyone could name except that his hands needed something to do that wasn't a fist. She had sat on a bar stool with a blanket someone's mother had crocheted decades before, the kind with a pattern gone soft and formless from washing, and she had watched 29 men decide, without a vote, without a meeting, that she was not leaving that building the way she'd come into it. Outside, the neon sign had buzzed and stuttered, throwing half its letters into the parking lot gravel, and a big man with a scar through his eyebrow had gone out twice to check the road, though nothing was coming. Nothing was coming because word had already traveled the particular way word travels in small places. Fast, low, final. The man she'd run from did not come that night. He did not come the next week either. By the time he tried, there was nowhere left for him to find her that wasn't guarded by someone who had decided, quietly and permanently, that she belonged to no one but herself. She had not known then that a bar could become a business plan. She had not known that grief could be zoned, permitted, drywalled. She had only known the coffee smell, and the blanket, and a man's voice saying, "You're safe here," in a tone that didn't ask her to believe it, just gave her the option, whenever she was ready, of finding out it was true. Now, in the present, in the same room reshaped into intake desks and a waiting area with a rug the mother's daughter kept tracing with one bare toe, that same coffee smell reached her again, unchanged across 11 years, and something in her chest loosened that she hadn't known was still cinched tight. The president watched her watching the pot. He didn't say anything about it. He had learned, across the years, that some recognitions didn't need witnesses, only room. Her own daughter sat near the window, drawing something on the intake clipboard's spare paper with the focused seriousness of a person twice her age, glancing up now and then at the mother's daughter with the frank, unhurried curiosity children extend to other children who've survived something. The coffee maker clicked off. Steam rose and thinned into nothing. Somewhere outside, an engine idled low, patient, waiting its turn. The mother came out from the back office with the intake folder pressed against her chest, like something that might spill. She was younger than the advocate had been, that first night, by perhaps 2 years, a difference that had once felt enormous and now felt like nothing at all, a rounding error in the math of survival. She stopped when she saw the patch on the wall by the door, the one under glass, the one with a dead man's name stitched into it. She didn't ask about it. She only looked at it the way people look at things they don't yet have language for. "You used to sit where she's sitting," the president said quietly, not to the mother, but to the advocate, nodding toward the window. He said it like a fact about weather, nothing more. The advocate didn't answer. She was watching the girl on the rug, the mother's daughter, who had stopped tracing patterns with her toe, and was now watching the advocate's daughter draw. Something passed between them that adults couldn't have negotiated in an hour of careful sentences. An offering. A small, silent permission. The advocate's daughter tore off a corner of the clipboard paper and held it out. The mother's daughter took it like it was a coin from a country she was still learning the currency of. Outside, the idling engine cut off. Boots on gravel. The screen door, new hinges now, oiled twice a year by a member who considered it his personal jurisdiction, opened without its old shriek. A man came in with a box of grocery store donuts, set it on the intake counter without ceremony, and said only, "Figured," before going back out to help unload something from a truck bed the advocate hadn't noticed pull in. This was the part of the club nobody put on a patch. Not the rescue. The donuts. The showing up on a Tuesday for no announced reason. She thought of the ledger, 11 years thinner then, the one she'd watched them argue over that first month. How much could the club actually spare? How much was pride talking versus math? She thought of how the number had never once, in 11 years, been the point. The point had been the willingness to keep asking the question. The president eased himself into the chair by the window, favoring the knee that had gone bad 2 winters back, and watched the 2 girls compare their drawings with the gravity of accountants. "She's got her mother's hands," he said, of the mother's daughter, though he might have meant something else, something older, something he still hadn't said aloud in 11 years, but was working, slowly, up to. She didn't answer him right away. She had learned, over 11 years of sitting across from women who flinched at silence, that silence was not always a wound. Sometimes it was a door left open on purpose, in case someone wanted to walk through it slow. The president's hands, she noticed, had thinned. The knuckles stood up like the roots of an old tree pushing through pavement, and the tattoo on his forearm, an eagle, once sharp-edged, had gone soft and blue at the wingtips, the way ink does when it has been carried a long time by skin that keeps living past its expiration date. He had not looked at her when he spoke. He was looking at the girl. "She favors somebody," he said again, testing the sentence, the way a man tests ice before he puts his weight on it. Outside, the truck that had pulled in unloaded lumber, 2x4s, a roll of chicken wire, a bag of Quikrete, for a wheelchair ramp somebody on the board had approved without a vote, because the mother who needed it had already waited 3 weeks, and nobody wanted her waiting a 4th. The advocate watched 2 men in leather vests carry the lumber like it weighed nothing, though she could see, from the set of their shoulders, that it did. 11 years ago this would have been unthinkable to her. Not the kindness. She'd seen kindness before, in smaller doses, offered and then withdrawn, but the steadiness of it, the way it didn't announce itself, the way it simply kept happening, Tuesday after Tuesday, whether or not anyone was there to see it. "You never finished what you were going to say," she told him, 11 years ago, outside, before the sun came up. He turned his head then. Something crossed his face. Not surprise, she thought, but a kind of relief, the look of a man who has been carrying a stone in his pocket so long he'd started to think of it as part of his own weight. "I know I didn't," he said. The girl looked up from her drawing, sensing without understanding that the room had shifted, the way children do, the way animals do, some older instinct reading the temperature of adults before the adults themselves admit it's changed. "Grandpa," she said, testing the word the way she tested most new words lately, turning it in her mouth like a stone from a creek bed. "Is something wrong?" The president looked at the child for a long moment, then at the mother, then out the window at the men carrying lumber toward a ramp that hadn't existed that morning and would exist by nightfall. "No," he said. "Something's just finally getting said." He set his coffee down on the porch rail, and the rail took the weight of it without complaint, the way it had taken the weight of 100 other mornings, though this one, she understood, was not like the others. "I had a sister," he said, "younger than me by 6 years. 1978 was the last time I saw her upright and breathing on her own." He did not look at either of them while he said it. He looked at the lumber, at the men, at the shape of the ramp rising board by board in the white morning light. "She married a man our father liked. That should tell you something right there. A father who liked the man his daughter married, back then, in that town. I was 22. I was already gone from the house, already writing, already telling myself that whatever happened behind other people's doors wasn't my business to open." The girl had gone still over her drawing, crayon lifted an inch above the paper, listening the way children listen when they sense a story is not for them, but they are being allowed to stay anyway. "She called me twice," he said. "Both times I told her to give it time. Both times I believed my own advice more than I believed her voice." He exhaled through his nose, a sound with no name for it. "Third time she didn't call anybody." The dog shifted against the girl's leg, and she set her hand on its ribs without looking down. 11 years ago," he said, "you came through that door barefoot, and I saw her face on you before I saw yours. That's the truth I didn't finish saying. I wasn't rescuing a stranger that night. I was trying to do, 30 years late, the one thing I hadn't done the first time it mattered." He looked at her then, finally, directly, the way a man looks at something he has decided not to flinch from. "That's not a compliment to you. That's a confession. You deserve to be helped for your own sake, not because you resembled somebody's ghost. I want you to know both things are true at once." She did not answer right away. Down at the ramp, someone dropped a board and swore, and someone else laughed, and the ordinary sound of men working seemed, for a moment, to hold the porch together better than any words could. "Both things being true," she said finally, "is the only kind of true I've ever trusted." He nodded once, like a man setting down a stone he'd carried so long his hand had grown to its shape, and finding his palm still worked without it. They stayed on the porch a while longer, not speaking, the way people do when the speaking has already done its work. Below them, the sign leaned against the wall in its crate of foam, waiting for the electrician who'd promised to come by 4, and the girl sat cross-legged beside it, running her thumb along the glass tubing like she could feel the years of dark inside it. "Is it going to say the same thing?" she asked. "The old sign?" "Same letters," the president said. "New wiring. Some things you don't change, you just fix what stopped working." At dusk, they wired it. 6 men held it level while a 7th made the final connection, and when the current went through, the whole run lit at once. No half-dead flicker, no dying middle letter, just the full word standing up clean against the coming dark, for the first time since before the girl beside it was born. A few of the younger riders whooped. Most just watched. She walked to the door where the frame had been reinforced that spring to hold a small brass plaque, unfinished last month, finished now. She took the patch from her jacket pocket, leather gone soft at the edges, thread frayed at one corner, where a thumb had worried it for years before it was ever hers, and she pinned it above the plaque with 4 careful pushes, the way you'd set something into ground that needed to hold. The girl came and stood under it, reading the little he'd been in charge of surviving without knowing his own back. "He gave you this," she said. "Not a question." "He gave me a door," her mother said. "This is just what I hung on it." Later, when the lot had mostly emptied and only the older men remained, sitting on lowered tailgates the way they always had, the president looked at the sign burning steady above the shelter that used to be a bar, and he said, to no one in particular, "Some rooms just take longer to fix than others." She had heard him say something close to that once, 11 years earlier, standing barefoot on a floor that used to be someone's version of the only door left open. She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now, the way you understand weather you've lived through rather than been told about. She looked at the sign, then at the men going gray and slow around her, then at her daughter asleep against a saddlebag with a mutt's head in her lap, and she thought, not for the club, not for the story, just for the private ledger she kept, that a life could be broken clean through in one direction, and still, given enough years and enough people willing to stay, be carried the rest of